What's up, everybody? Captain Matt here. Did you catch too many crabs today? Can't cook today's catch and hoping to keep them alive till tomorrow or a few days later? Do you want to keep your bait fresh? You don't have to cook them the same day you catch them. Want to know more? Stay tuned to find out. All right, so a lot of things we're going to talk about today are good practices just in keeping your crabs after you catch them. So if you know you're not going to be able to cook your crabs today, these things are even more important to keep in mind. So while you're out on the water and you're catching your crabs, and we're just going to assume that you're going to put them in a bucket or some sort of bushel basket, there's 3 things you want to keep an eye on to make sure your crabs live as long as possible: temperature, oxygen, and humidity. For temperature, it's usually cooler the better. Once you get them home and say you actually have a refrigerator, you're going to try to put them in a cooler. Somewhere between 50 to 60 degrees is going to be the ideal range. Once you get below about 40 degrees, it becomes too cold. It'll kill the crabs. While the crabs can live above 60, once you get them home and settled, to keep them as long as possible, you're going to want to be in that 50 to 60 degree range. Then we get to oxygen. Oxygen is important. Obviously, we see the crabs, they live in the water for most of their life, but they can adapt and live outside of the water. So once you catch them and bring them in the boat, they have to go through this process of dispelling all the water. That's usually why you see them bubbling and foaming, so they can actually live outside the water. Hence, they need oxygen to stay alive. Last is humidity. You want to keep the crabs a little damp, and you just really don't want them to dry out. So let's start first with your catching crabs. We're going to assume you use a bushel basket, some sort of basket, or even maybe a bucket. Buckets aren't great because they don't get as much oxygen circulating through them, but you can use buckets. As you catch the crabs and bring them into the boat, you want to keep whatever you're storing them in covered. Some people use burlap, I use wet towels. You just want to keep them covered, and it does 2 things. A, it keeps them out of the direct sunlight and keep the temperatures down. B, you want to keep whatever you're using, newspaper, burlap, towels, you want to keep it wet. I constantly soak mine offside the boat. If you have a wash down pump, you can hose them down, just keep them wet. One thing you don't want to do is take your basket and dunk it back in the water. So while you think this may help, it actually hurts. The crabs have to use a lot of energy to get rid of the water in their system so they can start breathing the oxygen. By you putting them back into the water, yes, they're going to get wet and it keeps them moist, but they're taking in all this extra water, so they have to go back through the process of expelling all that water. This adds stress to the crabs and uses more energy from the crabs. So let's just say you go through your day, you're keeping your basket covered, you're keeping your burlap or a towel wet throughout the day, and keeping them maybe in the shade in your boat. If you have a spot in your boat where you can kind of keep them in the shade, that's even better. Now you're going to take your crabs home with you. So most people are going to be out in a boat and they're going to have a truck or maybe an SUV and maybe even a car that pulls your boat and takes them home. You could also be crabbing off a pier. The same 3 factors come into play. Temperature, this is going to obviously depend on the time of the year. Preferably you would keep your crabs inside your car with the air conditioning in a stable temperature, and it keeps them out of the wind. It's not the end of the world if they sit in the back of a truck somewhere exposed to the air. If you are going to keep them in a truck and you don't plan on cooking them right away, again, try to keep them in a wet burlap towel. Keep them maybe in the forward part of the bed. You want to keep them out of the wind turbulence. Obviously, all the wind turbulence as you're driving home is going to have a tendency to dry them out. But the ideal thing would be to put them in a car, put them in some sort of cooler. Obviously, the ideal thing, if you see any of the wholesalers that come and pick up the crabs from the watermen, they're going to have a big box in the back that's air conditioned, climate controlled, and that's where they store the crabs. So if you can keep them inside your car, inside your truck, that's great. If not, make sure they're just covered and try to keep them out of the wind as much as possible. Me personally, once the temperature starts getting about 70 or above on my commute back and forth to where I'm crabbing out of, I'll try to keep them in the truck. I'll throw everything else in the back of the truck as much as possible. I have a spot in my boat where I could keep them in the boat, and it keeps them out of the wind and it gives them a little bit of shade. Once it gets more to early spring and late fall, temperatures cooler, 50, 60 degrees. As long as you keep them out of the wind, the temperature's going to be great for the crabs. So now you get them home, what do? You have several options. You don't necessarily need a refrigerator of sorts. Anywhere outside's fine. You want to keep them out of direct sunlight, and again, you want to keep them covered. Use a wet towel or burlap to keep them covered. You just need to find a place that's going to be quiet. You know, if it's windy outside, try to keep them somewhere where they're out of the wind and out of direct sunlight. This becomes quite challenging, again, when it's really hot outside. It may be a garage will work. Early spring, late falls, and overnight temperatures around 50, 60 degrees, that's ideal. No problem, keep them outside as long as they're covered. You keep whatever they're in, you know, nice and moist and damp. You could also try to use a cooler. And there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're using a cooler. Oxygen comes into play here. You can't keep the cooler shut. If the cooler's shut, the crabs use up the oxygen and they just suffocate. To keep the crabs cool, you're going to probably use ice. You can't keep the crabs directly on the ice. If you have a cooler, you line the bottom with ice, put some sort of shelving on there to give a little space where the crabs aren't exposed directly to the ice. If you have a cooler that you want to dedicate to keeping crabs, maybe you poke some holes at the top. Obviously, hot air rises and cold air drops, so it's not the end of the world if you're putting, a few holes in the top to keep your oxygen circulating. Obviously, it's not ideal for the temperatures, but the crabs do need the oxygen. Most people just keep the lid cracked somehow just to keep that oxygen circulating anyway. If you end up deciding to poke holes, you don't have to worry about the crabs possibly sneaking out and getting out of the cooler. So now if you're in a position where you have space and want to devote some money into a refrigerator, or maybe you're given a refrigerator, there's a couple things you need to know about keeping crabs in a refrigerator or walk-in. Walk-in is basically just a big refrigerator, and if you're lucky to have one, they're awesome. Bushel baskets take up lots of room, but you just can't go in with a regular refrigerator from the get-go. Most fridges are designed, the temperature is anywhere between, say, upper 30s to low 40s, and that's not what you want for your crabs. Like I said earlier, the ideal range is between 50 to 60 degrees. Thoughts and opinions kind of vary on this, but that's a pretty wide range. Now, if you have a refrigerator that you're attempting to use and it has a freezer section to it, the refrigerator actually gets its cold air from the freezer section. And this is why it's hard to keep the temperatures in a higher level. So to really find out, I'd recommend trying to get a cheap, say, infrared thermometer. They're pretty cheap. I'll try to find some links and put them in the video. Basically, it's a little gun, you point, you get a little red light, and it'll give you the temperature where you're at. So while if your refrigerator doesn't hit that 50, 60 degree range, there are ways to modify the fridge to get to that magic temperature. So the other two factors also come into play when we're talking about refrigerators and walk-ins. We'll talk about humidity. Some refrigerators have settings where you see it says more moist or more dry. You want it as moist as possible. You don't want those crabs drying out. Again, the good practice of keeping your wet towels or burlap or whatever you're using, even newspaper, keeping that wet on the crabs while they're in there, it helps. So refrigerators are sealed. You won't get any fresh air, so if you lack a lot of humidity in the refrigerator and you don't open it on occasion, eventually you're going to run out of oxygen in that refrigerator and the crabs will die. Obviously, you really can't keep a refrigerator door cracked, but with enough water and occasionally opening the door here and there, oxygen's typically not a problem when it comes to the refrigerator. Most people are going to look for a dedicated refrigerator to store crabs in. The great thing, if you actually have a nice refrigerator, you can actually store your bait in it as well. If you're using clams, you can store your clams in there. If you use chicken, you could temporarily just keep your chicken a little more fresh in there. Chicken wouldn't be a long-term solution for a fridge, but it could be a short-term solution, especially in the summer months when it's super hot, just to keep your bait as fresh as possible. Maybe you want to thaw out your bait and not have it frozen, but you don't want it sitting out in the sun either. Refrigerator's a great option to temporarily store your chicken. But because of the mess and the germs of having live animals and rotten chicken and clams, you're probably going to want to look for something that you're going to dedicate to that. Ideally, you're going to want one without a freezer section, unless you actually need a freezer and you want to store your cut chicken up there in the freezer. Most common refrigerators you'd find in a house, you're lucky if you can fit one bushel basket in there. You'd be hard pressed to find two, unless it's a full refrigerator and doesn't have a freezer section. So if you are shopping around trying to find something cheap, a lot of people look for these commercial refrigerators here. I happened to find this one on the Blue Crab forums from a real nice guy that I got to meet. He graduated to a nice walk-in. It was super nice. I was really jealous. But since I didn't have anything really dedicated to this, he gave me a great price on this. So I believe he said that this thing would hold up to 6 bushels without the shelves in it. It's basically just a double refrigerator. It does have controls up above where I can set the temperature to my magic spot. So while we're on the topic of conversation about fridges, we could talk a little bit about freezers as well. So while we're talking about refrigerators, maybe you do want one with a freezer on top. When it comes to chicken and trout lining, a lot of people like to freeze their bait and freeze their lines to make it easier for their next trip, as long as their bait's not all chewed up. depending if you're storing your line into, let's say, a 5-gallon bucket, some sort of bucket, or even a bushel basket, you're just gonna have to find a freezer with enough height in it where you can hold a whole bushel. So here's a pro tip: if you're using chicken, you freeze your lines in the freezer, make sure it's thawed all the way before you try to go to use it. I made that mistake my rookie year. Threw my bushel basket into a chest freezer I had, pulled it out. I think I even let it sit for 8-12 hours thinking it was totally thawed. I looked at it, it looked thawed. But like anything you put in the freezer, typically the center of whatever you're freezing is gonna be the last thing to thaw. I didn't realize that the center of my glob of line and chicken was actually still pretty frozen. Went out to the water, went to deploy my line, hooked up my lines, deployed my anchor, started running. Wouldn't you know it, the center was still frozen. And as I was watching my line go out nice, thinking, yeah, this is awesome, boom, the whole thing decided to go into the water because it was frozen solid. Needless to say, I lost probably about an hour today getting that big knot in and trying to undo all the knots that inevitably occurred. Make sure it's thawed. All right, that's gonna be a wrap for today's video. If you found it helpful, please hit that subscribe button. If you got any comments, tips, or tricks that you'd like to share, please put them down below. Until next time, I'll catch you later.